Welcome to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo, the director of AGLCA. Today we are going to give you one of the ideas on things that you might do as a side trip. As people are waiting for the locks to open this year, there might be some extra time on the Great Lakes. So we have brought in the Herveys, and they will tell us about their side trip on Lake Superior, which is one, not a whole lot of loopers spend a lot of time there. Some will stick their toe kind of through the locks and into Lake Superior so they can have done all 5 Great Lakes. But Mike and Deb have explored it more extensively, and they're going to share their thoughts on that topic. Before I bring them into the conversation officially, I want to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And now I'd like to officially welcome Mike and Deb to Great Loop Radio. Thanks for joining me today.
Welcome.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know Mike and Deb, they've been looping for a while. They are taking their time. They are doing lots and lots of side trips, and they're actually coming to us today from Maine. You're doing the Down East Loop this summer. Is that right?
Well, actually, we're in Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia. Okay.
So, yes, we're up north where it's nice and cool.
Yes, unlike the rest of us here in Alabama, it's a little toasty, but that's okay. We're kind of used to it in the South. But yeah, so I kind of gave a little bit about kind of your MO on your looping, but tell us about the two of you and your loop, and tell us about the boat you're aboard.
Okay, well, we're high school sweethearts and grew up in Northwest Illinois, boating on the Mississippi. So I probably took the tiller on our small family bass boat somewhere around 10 to 12 years old. And then my parents bought a sailboat when I was 14. And Mike was a frequent passenger on the very Howdy. So he started his boating experience when he was 15. So do all the math. We've got 92 years combined experience.
Wow. Amazing.
So we bought our own, our 25-foot shell draft sailboat in 85. And then in 94, we moved up to 35.5-foot sailboat. Made the jump so that we could get across Lake Michigan in daylight hours. We had, our daughter was coming along, and so we didn't want to be sailing overnight with a baby. And so then we moved to, Mike had an opportunity for a job on Long Island, New York. And so we moved both our household and the boat. And our new home port then was Greenport, Long Island. So
Beautiful
before
there.
we started the loop, we had rivers, Great Lakes, and ocean boating experience, which set us up very nicely for doing this.
So our plan was to
We're at 55. We didn't quite make that, but we bought the boat in 2014. We decided we wanted a trawler for doing the loop. And then we, and it's a Grand Banks 42 Europa, 46 feet overall. And like most people that do the loop, we think it's the perfect boat for doing the loop.
Yeah. And as I said, you've kind of taken your time doing the loop, done lots of side trips. Tell us why that is the best style of looping that works for you.
Well, we left, we put the house on the market and started in June of 2016. And because we spent the first half of our careers
lakes, we knew we wanted to get back and
spend time hitting all of our favorites, plus all the places we never got to on a 2-week vacation time frame. And so we also, at the time we bought the boat, we bought a condo in Florida. We decided we needed a place for our daughter to come home to. So we pretty much had decided, because we wanted to spend extended time in the Great Lakes, we would cruise from May to late September, early October, and then head back to Florida for the winter months, which is then when we also became the harbor host for Fort Myers.
Yes.
So that being said, we ended our first season. We left in June and we ended in late September in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. And that was just, we needed some work done, and it was a nice place for stepping back to the North Channel and to get up to, Lake Superior. So in 2017 is when we made our first foray into Lake Superior. We were working around a couple of rendezvous for organizations we belonged to. And so and what made us decide to do Lake Superior, even we could have gone back and just spent summers in the North Channel for that matter, but we had trailered that 25-foot first sailboat. We had trailered it up to the Apostle Islands and spent almost 3 weeks and loved it, but didn't get to see, on 25-foot boat, we just couldn't get the distances to see the rest of it. And so we had always wanted to go back and really explore Lake Superior.
Yeah. So for loopers who are doing, a little bit of a traditional loop route, so they would either be coming, Lake Huron, if they've just gone through the Erie Canal. Most are going through Canada and kind of coming, out of the Trent Severn, out of the North Channel and Georgian Bay into Lake Huron. So that's kind of the point where, regardless of how you've made your way to that point, loopers are coming through the top of Michigan through Lake Huron. So tell us from that point, where, how much of a side trip is this if you're just going to enter Lake Superior? We know you can spend a whole summer there, but what's kind of the route that people would take to diverge from the main Great Loop route and head for Lake Superior?
I would probably, as I'm coming through, I would be in the North Channel and work out your way through a few islands up to the northern tier of the North Channel. And then there's a fairly large island on the western end called St. Joseph Island. And you would follow the channel across the north of shore of that island. And that'll bring you right into the St. Mary's River, where you would take a right and head north. And the St. Mary's River, coming kind of backtracking, your other angle is just to shoot across the south end of the North Channel to Drummond Island or Little Detour and go up. And I think the distance then from Detour up to Sault Ste. Marie is
about 60 miles.
60 miles.
Okay. So yeah, so if you were somebody that was staying just in the US, you can of course still make it to Lake Superior, and that's the way that you would go from that point. So I hear a lot about the locks at the Sault Ste. Marie. What should we know about those locks? I know there's an American lock and a Canadian lock, if I'm remembering correctly, but I've never been to Lake Superior. So fill us in on what those locks are like.
Okay, so the American side is where all of the big lakers, most of them are 900 to over 1,000 feet. A pleasure craft can lock through those. They will lock you through, but you're going to go in between, just as on the rivers, commercial traffic takes priority. And to handle a 1,000-foot ship, I have no idea how high they are, but it's multiple stories. So the walls are much higher than what you would need for your pleasure craft. Okay. So we recommend, whereas the Canadian lock was the original lock on the Canadian side of what you're doing is you're locking around the falls of the St. Mary's as the Lake Superior falls out into St. Mary's River. So you're doing and mainly it's not even falls, it's rapids. So you're raising 21 feet to get into Lake Superior. And that Canadian lock was actually the first lock. It was the first to have electricity and a lot of other interesting things. But its walls are much lower, very similar to what you'd find in one of the other Canadian Canal lock systems. So we recommend staying on the American side, walking up. There's a great observation platform, a great museum that explains the lock. Watch one of the big ships because they are going 24/7 through there. You won't wait long at all to be able to watch a ship locking through. Then head over to the Canadian Canal. As long as all you're doing is transiting that canal, then you don't have any check-in with Canadian authorities. You just transit the canal. And then you kind of have the opportunity to do what the tour boat does, basically stick your nose up there and go 5 miles in, turn around and come back. Or there's a harbor of refuge, Whitefish Bay. It's about 38 miles from the lock. And you could go into there. It is a harbor of refuge. It has very rustic dock and a set channel, and the rest of it is shoals. So there's really no place to anchor.
Okay.
And what's nice about that harbor is it's about a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile walk to the Shipwreck Museum.
Nice.
Some people wouldn't necessarily want to see things about shipwrecks, but on the other hand, it's got everything you want to know about the Edmund Fitzgerald and all the rest of the shipwrecks, and a nice historic buildings related to lighthouse keepers and that sort of thing as well. So that would be your option for if you just want to peek in and come back out again.
Yeah. So Deb, one thing I want to ask, and either you or Mike can answer this, but you mentioned harbors of refuge. And for those who are maybe new to this or not Great Lake boaters, where you don't hear that phrase quite as often, tell us what you mean when you're telling us it's a harbor of refuge.
Well, unlike the rest of Michigan, that has good close harbors of refuge along Lake Michigan, Lake Superior does not, except for this one occasion. And that's because otherwise, I think the stretch between Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and Grand Marais is 70 some miles. And so that sits out there on the point of Whitefish Point, and it's available, certainly.
Yeah, it's a harbor of refuge. It's basic amenities.
Mm-hmm.
You may have a dock, you may not, and most likely the dock will not have power. There is one dock with 15 amp service, but it's protected from all directions of wind. It's got 360 protection. So
Yes.
that's what it is. You need to get off the lake, then it's a place you can go and you'll be safe.
Right. Now, all of the side trips on the Great Loop, once you kind of diverge from the main route, you do a side trip, you usually have to backtrack. So with Lake Superior, perhaps you might not have to backtrack if you wanted to do both, kind of the southern and the northern shore, but I understand that the northern shore is pretty remote. So from kind of a very big overview, tell us what your route was in terms of North Shore, South Shore, how far did you go? Just kind of the 1,000-foot level.
So we did three different trips.
Okay.
And I probably recommend the first one for if you just want a taste of Lake Superior, and that would be to follow the South Shore. You do have one long 80-mile day to get to the next harbor. It's Grand Marais, Michigan. There is not a marina. It's a town wall that can hold about 5 40-foot boats, but they also there's room to anchor there as well. Not a lot to see. It's just a spot to stop. The next spot, Munising, is where you're headed for. That's a municipal marina with docks and the standard facilities. In fact, they added a fuel dock in 2019, I think it was. So the thing about what you do in Munising is you take the pictured rock tour, because you can go past the pictured rocks and yes, you will see the coloring, but you won't know what you're looking at or why this strata is green and the next one's, yellow or whatever. So we highly recommend, and plus you'll never take your boat as close as those tour boats are going to go to the
right.
up to the rock. And it's definitely worth it. I mean, they are just, it's amazing what, nature can do. And so at that point, so that's about, let's see, 80 and another 60, that's about 140 miles to do that. So for a lot of people, that's going to be, a big trip.
Right. And actually a lot of loopers that I have spoken to, that's kind of was their turnaround point. Kind of the highlight is seeing those painted rocks and then turning around and heading back towards Lake Huron. Did you explore further than that though on any of your 3 trips?
So then the next trip was that same year after we attended a rendezvous in Mackinac. We went back and we did the Northeast and North Shore, about somewhere between the third and a halfway across. There are no marinas. There are no marinas that can handle depths more than 2 feet until you get almost all the way across to Thunder Bay. So it is all anchorages, but gorgeous, natural. And if you go that route, Batchewana Island would be your first place to go. And our travel distances were usually somewhere between 30 to 45 miles in this stretch because we wanted enough time to be able to get someplace and maybe take the dinghy ashore or do some dinghy exploration, and then maybe get and go to the next place the next day.
Right.
So we did about a half day travel day. So from Batchewana, then the next port is Sinclair Cove. Sinclair Cove is interesting. If you do the museums in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, you'll hear about this big Indian voyage that happened periodically, and it's recorded in pictographs on the walls, and they are, 700-800 years or more old, and they have survived all those vicious Superior winters, and they're still there for you to get to. Now it's a rugged hike, and you have to go out on a rock ledge to see them, but it's just something you'll never see, anywhere else. So that's kind of a point. If you were going to go just a little bit, you'd go to Sinclair Cove and then go back. Continuing on, there's a couple more great harbors. Gargantua Bay is a fairly large. It could hold at least probably 10 boats at anchor, probably even more. It sits it's around some primitive campgrounds in the provincial park, so there's trails. So you'll still see kayakers and hikers in that anchorage, but that's probably the last one you're going to see anybody.
And that's where the cell service quits.
Yeah.
Okay, that was actually going to be one of my questions, because I've heard that much of the North Shore, there is no cell coverage. It's almost like the northern version of being at the Dry Tortugas.
Yeah, and no VHF radio, so no Coast Guard weather at this point. And Michael, we'll talk a little later about the technical options because of that.
Okay.
Then the next one is probably our all-time favorite harbor in the lake, and that's Pilot Cove. And that's basically a one-boat cove. You come in through a tiny opening, and you're 360 protection from wind of any direction. And in all these harbors, well, from Sinclair Cove on, you're in the provincial park. The water is clear. In Pilot Cove, you could see 30 feet down. You still got logs from logging operation from hundreds of years ago. You always know where your anchor is, if it got set or not. And that way it's also like being, you see this picture in Pilot Cove, except for the fact that you've got fir trees behind you, you would think you were in some Bohemian water somewhere.
Yeah, amazing.
And then the last one we went to was Otter Cove. Again, it was great. It was a bay that went back inland quite a bit. And there's some dinghy exploration to do, an island with a lighthouse that you can hike. But that's where we said, we were hiking, and all of a sudden Mike says, you know what, we're not going to go to the lighthouse because the trail's getting too rugged. And if something happens, especially to me, you'll never get me back on the boat,
right?
Let alone down to the dinghy. So at that point we said, you know what, we've seen it. It's beautiful. I mean, you are right up, the mountains rise right out of the water. It's a little bit like, if anybody's gone up to Tennessee to Tellico Lake, it's a little bit like but even more, that you're like almost right in the mountain. And then when we came back, there's an island that sits out in the lake called Michipicoten, and we headed there. A couple of reasons. The weather was getting a little iffy, and it was also a bit of a short, even though we went out into the lake. And so we ended up having a gale and being there for three nights. It's an old fish camp. And so there you can get dinghy ashore and have some place to stretch your legs, and you will see, most likely see wildlife, and there's the shipwreck in there that you can, take over with your dinghy. As I said, the water is so clear that wherever there's a shipwreck, you will be able to see it just from over your dinghy.
Yeah.
So that's all the further we went there. And then we backtracked, and we pretty much hit the same places. Originally, we thought we might, leapfrog over so many, but there really was no way to do that without spending really long days and having to extend your time.
It's important. We turned around in part because we were about half through our fuel at that point, and there's no place to fuel up there.
Right.
So you have to be able to go about 450 miles and be comfortable with your fuel situation to get all the way over to Thunder Bay. There's just not any fueling opportunity up on the North Shore.
Right. And I want to kind of go ahead, Deb.
Now, I was going to say, for people who like remote and love anchoring, then I would say go for it. For people who like anchoring just every once in a while and certainly don't want to be in contact with folks, then the North Shore is not going to be for you, and you want to stick to the South Shore, which we'll talk about just a little bit
And
more.
after that hiking experience, then we remembered that we needed to take our little Garmin inReach device with us no matter when we got off the boat. So if we needed to call for help, we could, because VHF wasn't going to do it at that point.
So before we kind of wrap up the North Shore, how many days was your the out and back on your North Shore cruise?
Thing on here,
That was 15 days. We didn't see another boat except for a fishing boat that entire time.
So how, from a cruise planning standpoint, you may have a plan and the plan may have been 15, it may have been more or less, but I think you know where I'm going with this. You have to have enough, you have to be self-sufficient for that time frame because of the remoteness. So how did you plan that? How much food did you bring? How, your water is of course what you can carry with you. It's a pretty different style of cruising than most of the loop where you're jumping from port to port where there are always facilities.
Well, it's interesting with water. We carry about 2 weeks worth of water. Of course, 15 days is more than 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So we had spoken with one of the provincial park rangers there about the possibility of rewatering along the way. And her advice was not close to shore, not many streams, but when you're out offshore, just rewater, take water out of the lake from more than 2 feet down. And so that's what we did. We filled our tanks from using normally would be our anchor washdown pump.
Wow.
While on the way, we refilled our tanks and lived through it. So I guess that was fine. The reason they want to go deeper is that certain excrement from certain animals floats on the top and has bacteria in it. So anything that's not on the top water is fine.
Right. And we had also had a presentation with one of the organizations we belong to in Killarney, and he's the water tester for the province, all in the Georgian Bay area. And all the towns take from Georgian Bay and treat it just simply with, whatever many parts borax, bleached.
That are required. But he said in 20 years, there's never been a failure of a water test out of the water there.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing.
So we just rewatered out of there, and we always carry more food than we need anyway.
Yeah.
So that wasn't an issue.
Yeah, we have a grill on board like a lot of other people, and so and in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada,
Ontario.
Just across the parking lot is a mall, and far into that mall is a super Walmart. So you can stock up and provision as much as you need. We do tend to carry shelf-stable milk on board. We bring whatever we can fresh, but when that runs out, then we switch to the Parmalat or whatever.
Okay.
But the water's the key thing. It is so clear. You just take from there.
Like I said, definitely a different style of cruising on the North Shore, and not for the faint of heart, probably not for a lot of loopers, but an amazing experience. Let's take a quick break and play a message from one of our sponsors. When we come back, I know you had a little bit more to say about the South Shore, which is more commonly visited by pleasure craft. And I want to talk about, some of the challenges that you might face on Lake Superior. So we'll be back in a moment. Port of Orillia in Ontario, Canada is at the center of your Canadian boater fun and the place you want to stop between the Trent and Severn Waterway system to provision or simply enjoy the Sunshine City where the weatherman is most often wrong. Whether it's dining, theater, casino, or museums you're after, we have it all, and we're the last chance before Georgian Bay for great city fun. At Port of Orillia, we have everything you need. Let our friend John Heenan at SkyMed explain to you why your health insurance does not pay or only pays for a small portion of emergency medical travel transport. Say you're on the loop in Canada and have Medicare. You must get back to the USA to be covered once you are stabilized. That also is true for the Bahamas. No worries, SkyMed pays for transportation to your home hospital by a private medical jet, helicopter, or other means that can keep you stable until you reach the destination from anywhere in the world. Pets with you? They go home with you. What about your boat? Call John Heenan for more information at 954-520-4553. We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. Let me start that again. We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. My guests today are Mike and Deb Hervey. They are filling us in on their multiple trips to Lake Superior. As many of you who are out there cruising the loop right now know, there are some lock closures on the Illinois Waterway that is going to prevent this year's group of loopers from leaving the Great Lakes until roughly October 1st. So while there's some extra time perhaps on the lakes, this is an opportunity to take a great side trip to Lake Superior. So Mike and Deb, entice us, if you will, for those who may have a few extra weeks or even a month to spend up in those northern parts of the route. Why should they head for Lake Superior?
So it's just the air is just so pure up there, and the scenery all along the shoreline is so pretty. And so we left you with that first foray where we just went over to Munising so we could do the pictured rock tour. In 2018, we went back and we went clear across on the U.S. side. And so from Munising, your next stop is Marquette, Michigan, which is an old iron ore transfer town. And it's interesting to see a lot of great eateries, a wonderful marina with great staff and great facilities. So it's well worth the stop in there. From there, you would go to probably through the canal that's at the base of the Keweenaw Peninsula. You have Hancock on the north and Houghton on the south. So it's called the Houghton-Hancock Canal. Hancock has power. It's a wall, and Houghton does not. You just stay on the wall. It's free. So not too bad. From there, we went up the west side of the Keweenaw Peninsula to Copper Harbor, and that's because we wanted to get to Isle Royale, and that was the best stepping off point. Copper Harbor has a marina run by the state park system. Again, relatively new docks, very nice shower and bathroom facilities, and a nice staff there as well. It's a little over a mile walk into town. You got to get uphill to get to the road, and then from there it's a relatively level walk. Then from Copper Harbor we went over to Isle Royale, where we spent time in 3 different of the harbors there. We went to Rock Harbor first, which is where the National Park Service's main offices are, and it's a full marina with power. Facilities are typical kind of state park. They're not totally rustic, flush toilets and stuff, but painted cement floors, that kind of thing. From Rock Harbor, we went to Malone Bay. There is a couple of docks for small boats. I would say most looper boats, typical looper boats, would be anchoring out there, but there's plenty of room for multiple boats.
That's where we saw our moose.
Yes.
Really?
The moose pretty much. Yeah, that's their watering hole. And there's the island, out of each of these marinas and harbors, there's multiple trails, all well marked, all stating how long each one is. Most of them are very easy scale. So you can get in and see the wildlife and wildflowers galore, inland lakes on the island. And so just a lot to do. You just don't drop anchor and you're sitting there. The last stop was Wendigo, which is on the south end of the island. There is a wharf that can hold a couple of boats, and again, a couple of really nice trails. And they also, both the Rock Harbor, where the offices are, and Indigo do presentations probably 3 to 4 nights a week on different topics that you can catch. Then from Indigo, we went over to Grand Marais. Now, remember, we were in Grand Marais, Michigan. Now we're in Grand Marais, Minnesota.
Okay.
And it's a kind of a town. People stop as they're moving up into the to do canoeing and hiking. Just over, I don't know, why am I drawing a blank here? In Ely, Minnesota, it's a big canoeing area. And but again, grocery store, so you can get free provision, because otherwise you haven't been able to provision along this path. From there, we went to Bayfield, Wisconsin, which is the stepping off point for the Apostle Island National Lakeshore, which is named because there's 12 islands, a couple little ones. Again, the islands, the biggest, Madeline, has a marina. The rest of them, it's going to be anchorages. And the anchorages normally only provide one or possibly two directions of protection. So you pick one is going to work for the way the wind's going to go that night. And unfortunately, depending on the weather, you may not sleep real well because you might have to get up and go someplace else. There are some that are better than others. I would recommend Stockton Island has a gorgeous bay with a beach, and Devil's Island is nice because it has the sea caves that were formed from all of the wave action over the years, and you can take your dinghy in and around the sea cave.
And the lighthouse keeper docent there is glad to see people from time to time.
Yeah. They know their island. They know it. They catalog. They know exactly how many of each animal are on the island.
Wow.
And then the town of Bayfield has a very nice marina. And if you're not into the rustic anchoring and such, there's a wonderful couple different boat tours that go out, and so you can experience the islands and see them without having to do the rough anchorage if you don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then and also in Bayfield, there's a wonderful big top Chautauqua, the giant tent, and it's what Chautauquas were back when they started in New York, of just a variety of entertainment, mostly music oriented every night, and they are all top-notch shows, and that picks you up right in downtown Bayfield. There's also an IGA and a liquor store in downtown Bayfield, so it's another spot that you can then provision as you're going to make your way east and south.
Right.
So hits all of the spots.
We did that loop, in fact, it's through St. Marie in about 29 days.
Yeah. Okay. So, I guess from what you said, if you're just going to go as far as the Painted Rocks, probably allow for about a week, maybe a little less.
Right.
It could be done.
Right.
To kind of replicate your trip all the way out and back to, to the end of the lake, roughly a month, give or take. And the part you did on the northern shore that might be a little hardcore for some of us was about 2 weeks. So just some benchmarks if you have a certain amount of time that you're looking to spend. But I also know that there's some navigation challenges, some having to do with weather. And of course, you mentioned already a gale that kept you in one port for 3 days. So the best laid plans can often, take you more days than you thought if the weather is uncooperative. So talk to us a little bit about some of those challenges that you might face on Lake Superior from a navigation standpoint.
Exactly. The charts are very accurate. Nothing has changed, as far as the bottom in Lake Superior. So as far as navigation, that's not an issue. You are sharing the water with the Lakers, and you'll see Lakers every day. And just like we do on the rivers, we talk to every one of them. We let them know what we're doing, what our intentions are. We see them on our AIS or radar. And generally with the Lakers, if I'm going to be within a few miles of them, I let them know what I'm doing. We did pass a Laker one time on the St. Mary's River because he was going so slow. So he didn't have to anchor somewhere. He was going so slow. I just asked, can I pass you? And he gave me permission to do that.
And again, Mike, just sorry to interrupt you, but for those who aren't Great Lakes boaters, Lakers are basically the Great Lakes version of the commercial ships that we see in the rivers in the rest of the country. So enormous. I think Debbie said they're usually like 1,000 feet.
Yeah, they're continuously in motion. I don't know, there are somewhere between 30 and 50 of them total, but you'll see the same ones again and again and again because they just go from place to place. So that's really the only navigation hazard, but weather is the biggest one. The weather forecasts tend to understate the wave heights that actually exist. And just as any other northern climate, you can get fog unexpectedly. So the modern weather apps do a much better job these days. We had, between the 20-some years between the first time we went there on our sailboat and this time on the trawler, we saw a huge difference in forecasting. The Canadian forecasts are way more general or more broad area than the U.S. forecasts. But they did a good job of predicting the gale that we hid from. So we felt pretty good about that. And the tools we carry with us is we have SXM satellite weather, which helps us a lot in these situations remotely. With our Garmin inReach, we were able to get very precise 7-day forecasts because the VHF forecasts don't work and there's no cellular service. We did not have satellite as we carry Starlink these days, but that wasn't available at the time.
Mhm.
So you have to have the alternative communications, especially when you're up on the North Shore. Using your weather skills and your weather information, weather is the biggest single thing. There is only one weather buoy in all of Lake Superior, and it's sort of not even in the middle. It's a little bit to the it's off center. So not even the weather buoy helps you out a lot for most of Lake Superior. So it's the satellite information that helps the most.
And the distances you have to go to get from one harbor to the next, you pretty much are going to plan. You're going to start in fog. If you're lucky, it lifts sooner than later. It's got to pay attention to that dew point. We would definitely recommend that you have radar if you're going to go, just because the amount of fog and the distances, it's hard to wait. You can't wait till noon to leave, because now you're going to be getting in when the evening fog.
In one occasion, we were between two harbors, and we were a bright sunny day, and within minutes we were at Fog Bank, and we use our radar a lot, and we had it on, and you watch the radar, and we did go past a couple of boats out there, and we radioed them and talked with them on the way by to let them know that we were where we were, and so the radar is definitely a safety device.
The other thing to mention is water temperatures.
We were on one podcast where the woman says, I swim every day. Remember that the water temperatures on the North Shore are probably not going to hit 50, except when you're in one of the bays, the first 6 to 12 inches. So if you can keep yourself on the surface, if you must swim every day, you might be able to. The South Shore, they do get into the 50s and probably into the 60s, and some people, depending on the summer, will see 70s up close to shore or in a more a shallower bay kind of thing. And so also think about, on weather that you maybe wouldn't normally wear your life jacket, you might want to rethink that, because hypothermia sets in at minutes. And so if you went over, you're not going to be able to help yourself, even if somebody can turn around and get to you. So definitely want to keep the life jackets on is the other thing. We don't want to scare anybody, because 98% of the time you're going to have, your windows, and that's when you'll travel. But it's something to be aware of, because people just aren't used to that cold water usually.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a different, it's a different style of cruising. Even on the South Shore, big distances between facilities. So it's better to be realistic about some of the challenges that you might face. So any final thoughts before we wrap up about this particular trip?
We left out one of the reasons, and that's the stargazing. Up there's no light pollution. The stars, it's clear at night. The stars are just amazing, absolutely amazing, with the Milky Way in its full display. So, the scenery, the stargazing, we talked about the wildflowers. It's just amazing scenery, the clear water. We would do it again. Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And there's just one other thing when we're going through all the stuff from my favorites and things, is if you don't mind about checking into Canada, and you have no reason you can't, Roberta Bonmar Marina is very nice. There's a very interesting bush plane museum that talks about all the places where you have to get to by plane, but there's also the Agawa Canyon train tour.
Yes, I've heard of that before.
Up into the mountains, into this Agawa Canyon. And again, the scenery it's different than what you're going to see from the water, and it's just a really nice day trip. And if you've gone up there and you've spent a few days, then I would definitely take one more and do that tour.
And that's out of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which reminded me to mention that if you take the Canadian lock, you don't have to check in. Right. If you don't go to Canada, the Canadian lock is free passage for U.S. boats. You don't have to check into Canada. You can just keep going to the American side.
Okay. Well, thank you for that overview. I think you've planted a lot of seeds for some future loopers, and maybe given some ideas to some of the current group who might have a little bit of extra time to spend on the Great Lakes. So thank you for that. I mentioned, I thought you were in Maine, but you're in Nova Scotia. You are doing the Down East Loop though, correct?
Yeah.
Correct. We're about halfway around.
So where to from where you are today?
Tomorrow, if the wave forecast keeps up with what it says, we're going to be starting on the east shore of the south side of Nova Scotia, the mainland. We've been out on Breton Isle, Cape Breton Isle the last couple of days. Just beautiful up here. And but now it's the rugged part. So we get about 4 travel days to Halifax, and then 5 or 6 days around the rest of Nova Scotia, and then we'll be hopping back to Maine. And so we'll do all the normal Maine things. You know, we'll have to do Acadia National Forest, Mount Desert Island, Booth Bay, Bar Harbor, and we're going to plan to be back up in upstate New York for winter storage by the time the canals close. So October, between now and October 12th, we've got about 1,200 miles to cover.
Yeah, well, it sounds like quite another adventure.
And if anybody wants to reach out, because as you said, we are the side trip specialist. So we started in 2016. We finished last year, 2022, one day different from 6 years prior in front of the Statue of Liberty, with just under 16,000 miles on the 6,000 mile loop. So.
Amazing. But yes, so I have a couple of members, a couple of boats who have done all the side trips that I call on when I have questions about places that are kind of off the beaten path. So you are absolutely on that list. And thank you for sharing the details of Lake Superior. I've really got it. I'm not sure if I'm tough enough to do the northern shore, but it's on my list. It just sounds like a fascinating trip and different from what you'll see everywhere else. So Mike and Deb, thanks for sharing all that. We really appreciate your time today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And thanks to everyone who's watched or listened today. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.